But a couple of quick messages before that. So, OpenSSF is a Linux Foundation project that was founded to further security aspects, especially in the realm of open source software. There's a lot of work that needs to be done around open source security, as you must be very well aware. And the OpenSSF is tasked with making software more secure and thereby more reliable and just better quality software that way. So, joining us today is Rahul Jadhav, who is co founder and CTO at Acunox. So, please join me in welcoming him. Hello, Rahul. Welcome to the show.
Hey Ram, hello Ram, hello everyone.
Such a pleasure to have you here, Rahul. So it was very nice of you to take some time out to join us and share your experiences and other views about software security, especially in the open source realm.
Thank you very much for having me here. I'm really looking forward for this chat.
So you're currently co-founder and CTO at Acunox. So can you tell us a little bit about that and give us a background about Acunox as well?
Yeah. So we started Acunox back in 2020, right during the right when the COVID started. Fortunately or unfortunately, so our primary problem statement that we were trying to tackle back then was how do you mitigate some of the attack surfaces that are lurking in the Kubernetes space, not just detection but the mitigation. And that's where some of the fundamental ideas for starting Acunox came into being. One particular aspect that I might want to put up in the context is, when we were looking at MITRE TTPs, the MITRE TTPs, for anyone who don't know, MITRE TTPs are tactics, techniques, and procedures, typically that an attacker would make use of to gain access, to compromise your systems. And those TTPs usually have two types of rules. One is the detection rules and the other are mitigation rules. And when it came to mitigation rules, detection rules are very well covered by most of the existing tooling out there. But from the mitigation perspective, the tooling was very sparse, and we found that some of the basic mitigation rules could be easily handled with some not easily, but could be handled in a better way, like protecting trusted certificate bundles, like protecting system folders paths, protecting boot paths, protecting kernel modules, and things like that. All of this 100% is documented as part of MITRE TTPs, but we couldn't find any solution out there which could do an effective remedial implementation of these mitigation rules. And that's where Acunox came into being. We started off with runtime security solution, not just detection but inline mitigation or preemptive mitigation. That's what that is what our mantra is. And that's how our journey into open source started as well as an organization.
Oh, that's fantastic to know. So, in terms of the security landscape, there seems to be a few different places that you're focused on, right? So it's not just one or one specific case. So, what's this broader landscape like, and why did you feel the need to be in these many different places at once?
Yeah, two things happen. Once we developed something specific and we went to users, customers, or we saw that point solutions have very little value. uh, like usually users do not want to deploy point solutions. So that's one aspect. And the second aspect is, once you build something which solves one particular problem, you easily find ways into solving other problems. And being into open source, right, most of your users will start using it in the context you would have never imagined in the first place. These are the two things that happened to us. So we started off with runtime security solution, but then we said, oh, runtime security could be a great enabler for overall cloud security, cloud native security. So we said, why not build it ourselves? We can have an edge in the context of runtime security, and then we can solve the other problems as well, wherein we can make use of this visibility, this ability to do preemptive mitigation, and then leverage that in the context of other aspects, which includes something like vulnerability scanning, Once you know that a vulnerability exists within a container image, what is the next action that a user can take or a SecOps team can take? And that the next action typically is, a, you would want to ideally update the software itself so that the vulnerability doesn't exist, but that usually takes much longer time. You need some sort of virtual patch policy to protect you by the time your software gets updated. So some of these things, right, you have visibility into the runtime, you know that this particular problem exists within your solution, and then you try to do something about it at a high level. So what I'm trying to say is, uh, once we had a point solution, we saw that point solution, runtime security, inline mitigation, preemptive mitigation, could be leveraged more effectively in the context of overall Synapse solution, and that's what we started building towards. So that's one aspect of why we spread our wings, so to speak. The second aspect was, being into open source naturally helped us identify new avenues or new verticals, so to speak. For example, CubeArmor is one of the open sources that Aquinox started. It's a CNCF project today. And we found that users of CubeArmor started using CubeArmor in the context of edge security, 5G security. And there was one particular reason that stood out why the users were specifically looking for at CubeArmor in those particular domains. Well, it was again because of the specific ability to do inline mitigation or preventive mitigation, which means that before an attack could happen, you can actually stop a process from getting executed, or a network access call from being executed, or for a file access from getting accessed. So our open source users naturally took CubeArmor to all these new avenues, and that's how it started gaining traction. And we saw at some point in time, we saw that it would be better for us to support these additional avenues. It's a natural fit, so why not? That's how it began.
Wonderful. I'm always intrigued by what path open source takes. It meanders, it twists and turns, and then it finds its own sort of niches that you wouldn't have even imagined when you were creating creating the basis for the project and things like that. And so I, can we spend a few minutes in chatting about how invested um, Equinox is and how invested you are generally in open source? So um, what fraction of your work is fully open source, and do you do a lot of contributions, and what's that like?
Yeah, absolutely. So our initial premise of why we open sourced one of the key policy engine that we developed, was because it was taking a radically different approach, of doing this preemptive mitigation, like I keep calling, right? Like, this was a radically different approach. None of the other tool was doing it, and we thought that, it's good to be the first ones to solve some kind of difficult problem, but it's not necessarily, if you don't get enough feedback, and if you're not in a position to fail fast, so to speak,
Hmm.
then there is definitely a problem. So with that mindset, we said that it's best to open source it. And again, we went with the CNCF governance, because we found that lot of traction from the external contributors are towards CNCF projects. And I think, in hindsight, one of the best decisions that we had took was to go with the CNCF governance for that particular project, because of the kind of traction we got in the external community and contributors, and the kind of questions we got. We got LFX mentorships were simply amazing. Those engagements. Most of the core maintainers of CubeArmors are from LFX mentorship projects and GSOC mentorship projects for CubeArmor. So I'm really proud of that particular engagement when it comes to the way in which we have engaged with open source community in the first place. The other part you mentioned about what fraction of open source, so when it comes to CubeArmor, 100% of CubeArmor is out there in open source. So we do not maintain a fork of CubeArmor in the enterprise version. So we use it as it is, but we have of course added a bunch of layers on top of it to simplify policy recommendation discovery, just like most of the other network policies. It's much easier to, if you know what policy you want, You can just go ahead and use an open source CNI out there like Cilium and specify the policy.
Hmm.
Same is the case with CubeArmor, which is 100% open source. We're using the same thing, but in the enterprise version, basically we have added a bunch of layers, which will simplify the policy recommendations and discovery aspect.
Cool. I also learned that Aquinox is a member of the OpenSSF.
Yeah.
So could you touch upon some aspects about what that is like, and what kind of advantages an OpenSSF membership might bring to companies?
Yeah. I mean, again, being into OpenSSF, being a member of OpenSSF was again an important decision for us because uh, we are primarily a security organization, security company. We're not focused necessarily on monitoring and observability. We are focused on security. So it was natural for us to think about what are the avenues, what are the open avenues that we can embark on. Typically, when you talk about security, right, there are two parts to security. One is how do you do workload specific security, which where threat modeling comes into play. That's where your journey begins. And the second aspect is how do you handle the best practices, security best practices. And I feel that's where OpenSSF plays a big role. OpenSSF essentially gives us a clear framework regarding what are the appropriate best practices that needs to be followed, a clear framework as to what you can tell your users to do. And we found it in natural alignment with our thought process, and everything began from there, and we are really proud of being an OpenSSF member since day one.
That's great. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about Rahul the engineer for
Hmm.
the next 10-15 minutes. So tell us what your journey as an engineer has been, and where did you begin? What led you to discover security as a profession, and lead you to where you are right now?
Yeah. So overall, I've been in this industry for 25 years, roughly 25 years. And my contributions or most of my work was specific to data center network transport optimization, or so to speak, in the network and transport optimization domain, multi-part transport, quick as a transport, TCP, congestion control, flow control algorithms, and things like that. I worked with other open communities such as IETF to standardize some of the open standards. Uh, Again, so when it comes to security, when we talk about networks and transport, security is one of the intrinsic, or one of the things that goes naturally hand in hand with networks and transport related work. When anyone talks about network, you have to ensure that all the network communication is secure secure by design. So making sure that all the network communication best practices are followed, transport security best practices are followed, is something that had been part of my work even in my past organizations, but primarily from the data center or even handset based communication perspective. But when we started Aquinox is the first organization where security came to the forefront, in the sense that yes, we need to secure. Apart from the network communication, what are the other dimensions that you need to take into consideration to secure things? Uh, so from the engineer, from as an engineer, my primary job work used to be to write code. Frankly speaking, that's what I did for the major part of my career. I've worked on Linux kernel. I've worked on dozen other open source projects. I'm really proud of those contributions, like including Cilium, including Quick related open sources. Those basically, when you're working on those open sources, I got a gist of what all security aspects that usually you need to take into consideration, because open sources are specifically focused on security aspects. So that was again another aspect that I feel, being in as a contributor, as an engineer who's working in open source communities, gave me a chance to think about. From the other side, from the standardization perspective, almost every standards have these days a section where you have to give security considerations for whatever you develop. So that came in natural when I was engaged with ITF standards. And again, all of this, all of this different engagements sort of eventually led me towards working on the security side of aspects, when it comes to academics.
That's fantastic. I mean, do you feel that the folks who work on security inside a company are, um, they have among, let's say, the toughest job? Because you have all these app devs and engineering managers who are rushing to release features, and then all of these security guys somehow, traditionally, typically, seem to come at the very end, and they'll sort of mess up your release cycle, and they'll delay things. And is has that perception changed at all, and is it different now?
Yeah, you know security is a very difficult this thing, especially to especially defensive security, wherein you don't get any awards or any bounties if you secure something and it is secured by day one. No one even knows that the solution is working behind the scenes and you're secure. uh, Versus if you are into offensive aspects, right, like where you are specifically targeting a particular ecosystem or a module, then it becomes a much more, typically defense is called to be a cost center, and offense is called to be a, it's a revenue center, right? Like, that's the primary differentiation. So it becomes extremely difficult to actually make sure that, organizations realize how important it is to ensure that security is built into the systems right from day one. But these days, because of certain compliance, auditing, forensics requirement that are mandated by if you're operating in an enterprise space in pharmaceutical, for example, you have certain bunch of requirements that you have to take care of. Also, these days, uh, because of the open source nature of things, like, people are realizing that, an attack could cause a much bigger damage to your organization's reputation. And I'm talking about intangible aspects here. Like tangible, you might lose a revenue at some point in time, but let's say, for example, an organization is attacked and they lose a bunch of data to the attackers. Your reputation is tarred for a substantial duration of time. It never goes away. So organizations are becoming more they are now becoming more alert towards some of the security aspects of things. So it's good thing to see. If I go back 10 years back, right, like something like 10 years back, I would say that that kind of awareness was not simply present, or they didn't care. But in the cloud native world, I can see that people do care, and they do realize that a possible attack could prove more harmful than usually, not just in terms of revenues, but in terms of a reputation of an organization. So it now become it but truly, when it comes to developers, right, like, it is still a challenge. Like,
Mm,
if you're talking about a security, if you tell the developer to fix this vulnerability in a particular container image, the developer is going to fight back, saying that, this is additional work for me.
right.
Tell me specific, why should I care? Then you need to be ready with some additional information, saying that, if we don't fix this, these are the possibilities. Getting that kind of view is typically very difficult to do from a security perspective. Security, how do you give, and it should not be hypothetical, right? Like, developers know exactly when a person is talking in hypothetical sense or in real sense. So unless and until you give a proper reasoning or a logical hypothesis, the work won't get picked up. So there is still a pushback, but I think that pushback is for good. Usually, in when the container images are scanned, you get vulnerabilities in the tunes of 100,000. Yesterday I saw a video where JP Morgan Chase gets attacked 45 billion times a day.
Wow.
One of the things that was discussed was, what is a low priority vulnerability? There is nothing called as low priority. An attacker, if an attacker has a way to find out any way to compromise the system, everything becomes a liability for you. Every vulnerability becomes a liability for you. So creating that awareness with the
Absolutely.
development team is kind of critical.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting, what different kinds of problems, especially security engineers, have to deal with internally and externally, and putting up stuff. And I just wanted to do a quick shout out. The OpenSSF advertises a bunch of different courses. They've designed them, they host them, and they maintain them. So if there's certain aspects of this conversation that don't fully make sense to you, then I highly recommend scanning this QR code that's visible somewhere on the screen, getting to those courses, and improving on your knowledge about software security in general, and open source um, aspects of software security. So just a quick shout out there, and yeah, let's get back to the conversation. So I would definitely love to do a conversation that's entirely focused on challenges in creating a security first culture. But let's talk a little bit more about this whole realm of the containerized world. So um, software eats the world, is eating the world, what have you, and open source software is dominating the software landscape, obviously. But this whole revolution of containers has been quite something else. And I've read a lot about what it has done to security aspects. And could you give us a little bit of context about how containerization has really changed the security uh, mindset?
Yeah. I think I need to dial back like maybe 10 years or maybe even 15 years when I used to deploy software on Dell PowerEdge servers, and the kind of challenges we used to face when talking about security in those cases. It was very difficult to actually understand what an attack would look like, or what. So it was difficult to put in a framework in place. I think the biggest change that happened because of containerization in the security world was that with containerization, now you have a standard way of accessing a container, of executing a container, loading a container on a given this thing. And Kubernetes has gone the next level of even orchestrating those containers at scale. So now you have a framework where you can say, okay, the containers are going to be deployed in so and so way. These are the possible attack possibilities. Basically doing a threat modeling. Now you have a way of doing threat modeling in the context of containerized deployments, which means you have a clear path or a clear avenue towards making sure that you can establish some of the processes in place. That is the biggest change that containers have brought in by because of standardization of deployment, so to speak. Uh, Security, I won't say security is the goalpost is always changing, the target is always changing. Yes, there will always be issues. We keep seeing container escape attacks. We keep seeing that those are never going to go away, right? Like, whenever there is a software, there will always be paths to attack those softwares. But with containerized ecosystem, you at least know that this is the way in which these are the possibilities. And if you take care of these best practices, if you at least do a threat modeling exercise towards your workloads, towards your infrastructure, you are in a much better position to secure things versus a non-containerized deployment where everything is wide open. uh, as a security administration team or a SecOps team, the amount of branchings or conditions that you have to take into consideration in non-containerized workloads are immense. I don't see uh, security getting ingrained properly in those kind of environments anymore. Primarily because it's completely up to the deployment team at that particular point in time what they were thinking. Had they taken into consideration some of the security aspects, in case of non-containerized deployments, it's very difficult to deal with all those possibilities. So yeah, the standardization of The deployments with containerization has fundamentally changed the way in which security can be handled, and it's a big boom.
That's fantastic to know. And in terms of taking the first steps towards securing containers, now you mentioned that it's more deterministic to model where threats will come from. And
Hmm.
so, what are the like very basics of container security that you would um, encourage people to like follow and learn about and mandate?
I think if you have a project and you want to make sure that the best practices are followed, there are two things that I would recommend. One is you make sure that your OpenSSF score is at least above 7.5 or 7, at least, or even if it is not 7, you should have some deliberation as to why it is not 7. Your development team needs to understand. So like I said before, when it comes to security, there are just two aspects. One is you workload specific attack paths, which you can only understand if you do threat model, like stride analysis, or pasta analysis and things like that, where there are standard frameworks for threat modeling. And the other aspect is following the best practices in the containerized world, in the containerized image, containerization and Kubernetes orchestrated world. There are a lot of these best practices that are forward. From OpenSSF perspective, OpenSSF has given best practices in terms of how to maintain the repos. What are the code best practices that have to be followed? NIST has given best practices in the context of Kubernetes, saying that these are the Kubernetes best practices that you should follow. If you take those things seriously, and I'm not saying 100% coverage, uh, you should not try and aim for that measure. Usually it says that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. I've seen this happen multiple times in my career. Like, you try to aim for 100% code coverage, then the team becomes focused on incorrect things. When you try to attempt for a 100% of coverage anywhere, you try to fulfill that target score. That should not be the aim. Even if your OpenSSF score is, let's say, for example, 7 or 7.2, whatever it is, right? Like, you should know that these are the reasons why my score is not 8 or 9 or 10 even. And are we covered? Is the risk taken care of in some other way? That is basically something that essentially these best practices frameworks provide you, an avenue where you can actually judge how bad the overall security aspects are in your organization or in a specific GitHub repos or Git repos, or specific code repos or container images or Kubernetes deployment. It could be anything. There are specific frameworks available which tells you these are the best practices that you need to follow.
So it's it's wonderful that you mentioned some OpenSSF projects. I think scorecards is very effective in helping communicate what the health of a certain project is,
Yeah.
and I think knowing upfront that this is what you're sort of getting into is wonderful. So there's another community I manage, which is Cloud Foundry, and we're talking about implementing scorecards for a lot of our open source repos and things like that. So I highly recommend all our listeners to check out the OpenSSF scorecard project. Again, it is fully open source, available on GitHub for you to take a look at and apply within your teams. And so um, there's a few things that you mentioned during your conversation that I'd like a little more clarity about,
Mhm.
Rahul. So you mentioned something called stride.
Yeah.
For could you elaborate on that? It's not something that I'm aware of.
Yeah, so stride is one of the technique for threat modeling. What it does is, whether you have taken into consideration, I forgot the full form of stride: tampering, repudiation, integrity, all the attack uh, possibilities are mentioned as part of stride analysis. So basically what you do is, you identify the trust boundaries first. You identify all the elements of your application or your infrastructure or your deployment. Then you identify the trust boundaries around it. Like how many of it can be trusted? In case of cloud native world, your trust boundaries are becoming more and more thin. That gives you an avenue to think from a trust perspective in a different way. There are tools available out there which can help you towards achieving or handling this stride analysis in the first place. But fundamentally what it does is, as a security team, and again, stride analysis should be baked in into the design process itself. So when you are building something new, let's say a new module in an existing product, or a new product itself, or a new solution itself, you can bake in stride in as part of the design process, as that stride becomes one of the aspect. What then happens is that the outcome of stride will tell you that these are the avenues of security that you need to consider and you have to focus more towards. That also becomes an input for your development team, saying that okay, there is a risk here, maybe we should handle it in so and so format. It also becomes an input for your QA and validation team, where validation team knows that these are the possible security issues. So what stride essentially allows you to do, or threat modeling in general allows you to do, is to identify possible weaknesses into your systems, based on the trust boundaries that are available. Based on the trust boundaries that are identified. And again, this is subjective in nature. Like, you can't run a
Okay.
tool and say, give me a stride analysis of my this particular deployment. That's not usually never effective. You have to question yourself, and you have to give a realistic answers, just like in case of OpenSSF badge, right? Like, it's a subjective assessment, where scorecard is not a subjective assessment, but an
Hmm.
OpenSSF badge is a subjective assessment, where you have to answer some questions, and then if you give a realistic answers, you get a realistic the assessment of your this thing. Similarly for stride, once the trust boundaries are identified, you will be asked whether this communication is secure. And if you say it's not secure, then that becomes a possible action for you as a development team or a product team to take into consideration. So it's very effective. uh, I've been using threat modeling as an important aspect in all my projects for the past 10 years or so. It's extremely important to the sense, to an extent, that it does, apart from security itself, it gives the whole product validation, QA, and design and development team a view into the system which they have never might have considered before from the trust perspective.
So it seems to me that security largely begins with a slightly different mindset. So you there's this term secure by design. There's it's obviously very self-explanatory, but I'd love to get your thoughts about uh, how would somebody with sufficient knowledge about security approach designing an application versus how is it done in the absence of this whole secure by design
Yeah,
paradigm?
yeah,
Can we get your inputs on that?
absolutely. Look, I have to be candid here, right? Like, whenever you're designing a new product or an application or a solution, your primary goal is to check whether that solution, product, or an application will work. Right? You have user requirement, and that comes natural. Uh, so, you know taking security into consideration is definitely going to weigh in on some of the efforts that you might otherwise spare in other directions from the requirement perspective, and that's completely natural, is all I can say. The only thing that any team should take into consideration is, I would say, at least to make sure to do some sort of basic automation which requires maybe few hours of work, not more than that, to ensure that let's say, when it comes to code security, you basically take into consideration the OpenSSF scorecard. You have a GitHub action, uh, predefined GitHub action, which all you have to do is just click a button, say I want GitHub OpenSSF scorecard. The pull request is automatically created. You get a workflow out of the box. It takes roughly less than an hour to actually set up that environment. And you are anyways going to set up Git. You're anyways going to set up a bug reporting system. You're going to anyways set up bunch of other things. Take into consideration some of these security best practices, which are high, which are it is possible to automate right out of the box. Um, I wouldn't have said, this would might this all these things would not have been possible maybe 10 years back. Like I said, because everyone was working in their silos, but with the containerization, with Git based mechanisms, with marketplace actions, with a bunch of other things, it has become much more easier to follow the notion of security by design, secure by design. Certainly folks who are working on a big project, who are envisioning a big project, for example, uh, there are certain work items that I am related to, which are just started, I would say, like for example nephew. I will talk more about it later. That work has recently began, like we had second release of nephew recently. uh, the obvious question that came to mind is that, we are trying to deploy things at large scale, like thousands and hundreds of thousands of microsites, edge sites that will get deployed. If we don't consider security by design, or if we don't have security as an intrinsic element of whole of this project, the project will falter at some point in time. So it is better to take into consideration. So all in all, there are 2 points. One, the amount of friction has reduced a great deal because of some of the automation that has been that is now in place. It's much more easier to follow best practices now than ever before. And the second aspect is, if you're embarking on a big project, ensure that some of the security principles are followed, like threat modeling is done, like best practices automation is done. So that comes out naturally, that should come out naturally during your discussions.
That's great. Um, Now I'm going to bother you with helping me define another popular term in the industry. So I love the way you put, so many different aspects of secure by design. I also want to get some clarity around zero trust security. It's being spoken about a lot. um, I understand very basics about what that is, but I'd love to hear from you as a security expert and a practitioner. What is zero trust and why is it important for the world right now?
Yeah, I mean, I would start by giving a book definition of zero trust, and then give an example, like, one particular example that I recently heard about. So zero trust is basically, rather than doing signature based policies and rules where you say deny something specific, do not allow certain specific, or audit something specific, you might want to say only allow something specific and deny everything else. That's what ideally a zero trust architecture would mean. Now, zero
Okay.
trust architecture can be put into play across multiple dimensions. It could be network, service, application, systems, platforms. It could be anything. So, but the fundamental notion is, you allow something specific and deny everything else. Now, I quoted another example just some time back, like, there's this case study by JP Morgan Chase, where they said that we are getting 45 billion attacks per day. Attackers and the attacks have increased 8,000%, not 80 or 800%, 8,000% the attacks have increased in some of the verticals as compared to a few years back. Now, the only way to actually secure something like this would be to make use of you have to change the paradigm fundamentally, right? Like, you have to make use of zero trust security. Again, it's not a one day event where you flick the switch and say that, okay, now I am zero trust compliant. It's not going to be that easy. But it's again a process. uh, and again, it has to be done at multiple dimensions. It's going to be, like I said, network, service, application, platforms. You have to make sure but if you have that mindset, it's a cultural shift,
Hmm.
where, the way in which the security engines are deployed, the way in which the security policies are deployed, fundamentally change. So yeah, I mean, zero trust is now mandated by US federal agencies. You'll see more and more of that discussions happening in the coming few years. You'll see more and more security engines conforming to those needs. In fact, when we uh, created Cube Armor, one of the fundamental design notion that we had was, it should make sure that we should be able to specify policies in the form of allow specific thing and deny everything else. Like, denying specific things is not going to work. You will have thousands of when you do a container scan, today when I do a container scan, image scan of the organization, of all the images that are in my organization, I roughly get 100,000 to 200,000 vulnerabilities that are reported. It's
Right.
impossible to, it's impossible, right? It's humanly impossible to uh, to fix those things. And by the time you fix those things, 100,000 would have more emerged. So you cannot play that catch and
Yeah,
that kind of
yeah.
game.
Yeah, I sense that security is obviously not easy, and looking at all of the reports and other things that we're getting, it's definitely something that organizations need to prioritize from the get-go. I think there's a much better understanding of what tool chains can be and things like that, compared to 8 years, 10 years ago. And so there's I think teams and organizations are running out of excuses for not being very secure these days. um, I'm going to pick on another aspect of what you just spoke about. So there's, you mentioned that the US now mandates
Hmm.
zero trust as policy and things like that, and this present series is a bit focused in the India region.
Yeah.
So there's things that I want to discuss locally, and I'd love to know and understand, are there agencies and other things that exist in India that do IT security as policy, as provisions? Is there a government level participation or even awareness at this point? And if so, could you share some
Yeah,
information
yeah.
about that?
I'm glad you asked. There are initiatives even from the Indian government aspect. For there is an organization, there is a central organization called CERTIN, uh, which basically mandates or make sure that certain policies are followed by organization in certain verticals, certain spaces. Like, it could be medical, healthcare, pharmaceutical. There are certain best practices that are mandated by CERT in. And then there are guidelines from from RB words.
Yeah, so I think we have a small technical disruption. Rahul will join us momentarily. He did warn me about.
Yeah, am I back?
Hi, Rahul, you're
So
back.
sorry.
Yes, I'm so sorry. You did warn me about this. I should have.
No, no, no. This. I'm back. So now
Yeah,
there should not be a problem.
yeah.
Sorry about that.
You were
Uh,
talking about certain,
yeah,
and that's you were starting to talk about the next
yeah, yeah.
organization. So
The other is there is a mandate from RBI when it comes
yeah,
to financial institutions. There is mandate from RBI as to what kind of cloud native security uh, best practices you need to have in place. So it's there. Like, there are mandates from the federal agencies, even from even within India.
that's wonderful to hear. So I hadn't come across these things before, and it's lovely to hear from you. And do you think there is a path that one can take as an engineer who's interested in public policy towards being more participatory about all of these things than just, okay, here's like a bunch of different things that the government mandates, let's consume those? So you think there's a path towards participation? Is this a two-way street?
I think there is, and the part to participation has become much more simpler in the past few years than it was like few years back. Like, for example, one of the thing that I would like to quote is the participation in telecom standards. For example, India has its own governing authority called as TSDSI, which in turn contributes to 3GPP technical specifications and things like that. It is now much more easier to participate in these forums, these industry forums, than ever before. Even if you are an individual contributor, if you have some background, if you have enough motivation, there are avenues available where you can contribute in such local forums, and then there are global forums anyways, which have also become much more easier. For example, there is I know Linux Foundation has security forum. CNCF has tax security. Kubernetes has its own SIG security. Every organization or every forum has a security arm these days, in which you can participate and make things happen based on what you see or what you are interested in.
So, which brings me, I guess, to the next rather more important topic, that is how important and how available are security meetups and security community events and things like that, um, in your opinion, for somebody who's trying to get started here?
Yeah, I think the meetups are now happening more than ever as compared to like for even couple of years back, right? Like cloud native security meetups are a very commonplace these days across all the regions. Whichever region you are in, you are in India, you are in US, of course, has always been there. But even if you are in Middle East or anywhere, you have cloud native meetups, security meetups that are happening across the world. Bangalore, in India, Bangalore, Delhi, Pune, there are a bunch of Kubernetes events that are happening. There are CNCF events that are happening. And lot of times you might find very few participants, but those few participants are bringing in some real change. Do not mistake that. Do not go for, if you don't see hundreds of people in the room,
Hmm.
and if you see just four or five people discussing in a particular forum, it doesn't mean that the work is not happening. The work still happens, because there is enough motivation for those four or five people to actually take things to the next level. Then they contribute to our higher level. So it completely depends upon an individual's uh, motivation level, rather than, and of course there are organizations who are also pushing forth this
Yep.
this agenda that you need to participate in open forums. It's not going to help just the open forums or the industry practices, but it's going to help organization itself. That's the notion that we have in Aquinox as well. That's the organization that I belong to. We fundamentally believe that as an individual, if you are interested, if you are enough motivated to take an initiative to be part of such industry forums, you should definitely do that. In fact, it would be highly recommended, because that way you will bring in some understanding from the industry back into the organization, and there is no equivalent of that. You cannot do that by paying someone, or
Right.
that's a culture that you need to build as part of your organization.
Yeah. Speaking of meetups, I noticed that you're speaking at one next week about the
Yes.
Nefio project.
Yeah.
Could you give us a little background about Nefio, what that is, and what you're going to be talking about?
Yeah, I mean, Nefio is a very interesting project. I'm one of the chair for SIG security in Nefio. Nefio is basically bringing large scale network automation, a cloud native network automation, where we are basically making use of Kubernetes as the foundational layer for deploying thousands and thousands of sites across. So traditionally, the problem had been with Kubernetes, you can set up one cluster easily, and then you can manage that cluster. But with cloud native deployments, you have thousands of clusters in the telecom space with 5G like architectures, where everything is getting disintegrated. Your RAN, your radio access network, is getting disintegrated into CU, DU, RU, a radio unit, distribution unit, control unit. And those distribution control units are going to get moved into data centers, or even in some cases into public cloud native environments, which means you are going to deal with much lower operational expenses, because 60% or 70% of a typical operator's operational expenses are in maintaining these RAN networks, so-called RAN, radio access networks. So if you reduce the operational expenses at the RAN and push some of the units back into public cloud space, you are reducing your operational expenses to a great extent. But the bigger problem there is, how do you ensure that performance and security, these are the two trade-offs there, you manage those two risks in appropriate way. So Nefio is a big cloud native telco, not only telco, but a cloud native network automation uh, uh, system, basically leveraging Kubernetes based practices like Kubernetes native KRM model, Kubernetes resource model, utilizing that at scale. And then currently the vertical that the community is focused on is telecom, but in the future it could change to general enterprises as well, because the same notion exists. So
Yeah,
so we are targeting telco automation first, but then expanding to other spaces as well.
fantastic.
So if you are in Bangalore, please do visit the Nephew meetup. It's in Google's office in Bangalore. Would be happy to have you there.
Awesome. Um, so I'm just going to close this out, Rahul. I'll just take a couple of minutes to um, do some shout outs to um, some OpenSSF initiatives. So there is an education survey out there, which I'd love for security practitioners to come in and fill out. It basically is about how and where education about open source security should should be done, and we'd love to hear from security practitioners about how to shape uh, education and educational initiatives around that space. I already showed you this once before, but if you're interested in some free courses in open source security, please do check this out. There's a bunch of resources there that are very useful for early stage security enthusiasts, and also some intermediate level courses out there. So please check it out. Rahul, thank you so much for being here. I think I learned a lot, and I'm sure that anybody viewing this later will definitely have a lot to learn about as well. Um, and so if you had any closing comments about finding communities to participate in, learn from, finding some online resources that people should definitely check out, can you share a few
No,
with
yeah,
us?
absolutely. I mean, the world is much more open than ever before. There is no restriction on how much you can participate. Everything depends upon your individual's motivation level, initiation level, and the world is there out there. There are a lot of industry forums out there who are waiting for you to participate and make this world a better place. Right? There's no better goal to achieve than this, and it's certainly. At an individual level, you can do a much more bigger, you can bring in a much more bigger change in this world than ever before. I think that's the only closing that I can think of.
Thank you so much, Rahul. That was such an informative session. Like I said, this video will be available for viewing on YouTube on the OpenSSF channel much later. So, yeah, check it out. Please reach out on social media at OpenSSF on X, Twitter. There's also, a Slack that the OpenSSF has, so you can join in there, post any queries that you have about security in general, and have experts from around the world coalesce around your problems and try to solve them. So thanks once again, Rahul. Thanks
Thank you.
everybody for viewing, and it was a pleasure hosting you.
Same
Thank
here.
you.
Same here. Thank you very